Welcome to the inaugural program of our newest series, A Seat at the Table, Women in Global Leadership. My name is Maureen Pace, and I am the president of the World Trade Center Dublin, Ireland, and also serve as the president of the Drew Company, vice president of the Drew Company. I just gave myself a promotion. What a year it's been, and what a year it's been for women. Women's History Month also marked the one-year anniversary of the pandemic. To say that we have all endured a lot is an understatement, especially for women. To celebrate Women's History Month and extend our recognition of International Women's Day, we are pleased to launch A Seat at the Table, Women in Global Leadership. The program was inspired by author Susan Sloan and her new book, A Seat at the Table, Women, Diplomacy, and Lessons for the World. In it, Susan shares the impact of gender-diversified leadership and why varied voices lead to stronger resolutions and enhanced team dynamics. We are so pleased to have her as our program moderator today and throughout this series. Women are more inclined than their male counterparts to use soft power through tools such as dialogue and engagement, rather than using the threat of arms or exclusion. This ties to the research presented in Susan's book. It is proven that when women are involved in peace processes, an agreement is 35% more likely to take place and last at least 15 years. Additionally, higher levels of gender equality are associated with a lower tendency for conflict. Women's progress is global progress. Today, Susan will lead a conversation with Ambassador Swanee Hunt, an American diplomat, activist, security expert, philanthropist, academic, and artist. Before we get started, I'd like to extend my gratitude to our team and company for inviting me to open this program and series. I'm honored to be one of the many female executives at our parent company, the Drew Company, and I'm pleased to be here representing the World Trade Center Dublin, Ireland, in partnership with the World Trade Center Washington, D.C. The World Trade Center Washington, D.C. is the trade programming arm of the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center. For over 20 years, our company, TCMA, has proudly served as the executive manager of the Reagan Building through a unique public-private partnership with the U.S. General Services Administration. Together, we have developed the Reagan Building into a hub for government, business, global commerce, and cultural exchange. I also want to extend a special thank you to our partners, the Associates of the American Foreign Service Worldwide, Azar Foundation for Children of the World, Howard University School of Business, and the Women's Business Collaborative. We value your continued partnership. Now, it is my pleasure to formally introduce our moderator for today's program, Ms. Susan Sloan. In addition to authoring A Seat at the Table, Women, Diplomacy, and Lessons for the World, Susan has met with more than 60 countries through diplomacy, advocacy, and experiential education. And at the age of just 30, she completed a life goal of visiting all 7 continents. Susan holds a master's degree in global strategic communications from Georgetown University and graduated magna cum laude. We thank you all again for joining us this morning. To learn more about other upcoming programs, please visit us at rrbitc.com, and please engage with us today by following us at Reagan ITC DC. Please also use our hashtags, Where Leaders Lead and Diplomacy Table. Without further ado, I turn it over to you, Susan. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Maureen. It's great to be here with you and the rest of the team at World Trade Center Dublin and World Trade Center DC. I'm Susan Sloan, and you have a seat at the table. We're in the final days of Women's History Month, and I'm so glad you could join us. And no matter where you are, whether it's at a desk, a kitchen table, your couch, a patio, holding a child in your lap, or even making lunch, an early lunch right now, the first thing is first, you're here, you made it. A special thank you to the World Trade Center, Washington, D.C., Dublin, and Webport Global for creating this series, A Seat at the Table, Women in Global Leadership. There are so many people behind the scenes right now who are making this series possible. I'm not going to name their names, but you know who you are, and thank you. The series is based, like Maureen said, on my book, A Seat at the Table, Women, Diplomacy, and Lessons for the World. I spent about 8 months gathering stories, about 30 interviews spanning the globe, from women with varying leadership styles. And I'll list out those countries in the book: Afghanistan, Albania, Australia, Bulgaria, Croatia, Denmark, Finland, France, Hungary, Iceland, Kosovo, Kyrgyzstan, North Macedonia, Mexico, Namibia, Singapore, Sweden, and of course, the US. So why did I do this? Foreign policy research states that companies with the highest percentage of women in management are 47% more profitable than the lowest. So for the for-profit sector, it makes sense to have women here. And for the policy sector, participation of civil society groups, including women's organizations, they make a peace agreement 64% less likely to fail. So I discovered that gender parity, equity, and equality positively benefits everyone. Right now, we are in a pandemic. I am zooming in from you don't want to know where. And countries are facing huge challenges: migration, terrorism, climate change, the spread of fast-paced technology. Who is around the table matters. Businesses cannot solve gender diversity and parity alone. It's personal. And we need personal stories to understand why it's important and what we can do to change the system. So in this series, you're going to hear from global leaders who have a seat at the table. And yes, don't worry, this is being recorded and will be available on the YouTube channel of the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center about a week after the program. So if you like the program, make sure to share it with your friends. If you have questions during the program, put it in the chat Q&A and we will get to as many questions as possible. There will not be a formal Q&A session, so whenever you have a question, type it in, we'll take a look and see if we can get it to our speaker. Also, we know you're on social media right now, so you have to join the conversation. Use the hashtags diplomacy table and the hashtag where leaders lead. And if you want to know who to tag, at Reagan ITCDC, or me, at Real Susan Sloan. Let's have a conversation together. Now, let me tell you about our distinguished guest, Ambassador Swanee Hunt. She has been published in the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and CNN, to name a few. You even may have seen her on TV. She gives commentary for major television networks around the world. Ambassador Hunt has authored 4 books. I've only authored 1. 4 books. She's also worked in 60 countries, and she has served as President Clinton's ambassador to Austria. She hosted negotiations there. She focused on stopping the genocide in Bosnia and stabilizing the neighboring Balkan states. That's not all. She's also for inclusive security. So what's Ambassador Hunt's overall goal? To transform who makes decisions about war and peace. On top of that, for many decades, you will not guess this, I didn't know this either, she has raised herds of buffalo along the Colorado Trail and Continental Divide. What does this woman not do? Ambassador Hunt, welcome to A Seat at the Table, Women in Global Leadership. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Yeah, and however this goes, it's easier than keeping buffalo fenced. So.
Well, now you got to wrangle people to the table. It's a different kind of herd.
That's right.
So Ambassador Hunt, the first question I'd love to ask you is about war and peace. In 2003, the New York Times defined war as an active conflict. It claims more than 1,000 lives. And out of the past 3,400 wars, humans have only been in peace for 268 years. That's roughly 8% in recorded history. Now, you know, Ambassador Hunt, that war changes lives. It defines a generation. And war, ultimately, it impacts trade. So, Ambassador Hunt, you have seen the atrocities of war. You understand it. How can countries stop war before it begins, and how do women play a role in that?
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Susan. May I start by saying thank you to all the organizers here, and to you particularly, Susan. I'm big fan of you and Seat at the Table. And since we're at World Trade Center, I want everyone to notice my background, which is small pieces of wedding dresses that are sewn together from India. Okay, now back to war, okay? Except not back to war is the point. When you have women, and I'm going to sound really chauvinistic, so forgive me. I'm never talking about all women, okay? I'm never talking about all men. There's a whole continuum, a long continuum of men to women. Men to men and women to women. And I'm sorry to digress. So you've got this long continuum. But if you were to take the mean, you do a bell curve, you'll find there's a difference, a significant difference between the largest group of men and the largest group of women. And that difference is not nearly as wide as the difference from one man to another man, but there is this difference in the bell curve. That's where the difference comes when you're trying to stop a war or prevent a war. It's that little bit right there. Because as you know, we all know, it depends who's at the table at the time. And that's not a huge number of people, right? So getting the right people to the table is key. If you don't have that kind of stability, you can't have the trade that you need. If you don't have honesty, if you've got a corruption, most companies don't want to go in to that kind of unknown, and they don't feel that they can trust the partners. So anything that brings women in, even if you decide, oh, well, that was the wrong woman, et cetera, that's always going to happen. I mean, you talk about wrong men. Yeah. Okay. So you don't jump into this. Well, what about, Indira Gandhi? Oh, well, what about, blah, blah, blah. Now, this isn't about the exceptions. This is about the norm. And so what we know is that there are a dozen reasons that women tend to really stabilize, and we can talk more about that, about why it happens. Sometimes it's very intentionally. More often, it's women being women. And I don't want to fall into this thing about we're mothers, so we want peace. I will tell you, though, Susan, I've done literally hundreds of interviews, thousands of hours. The one thing that is said by almost every woman is, well, we're mothers and therefore blah, blah, blah. But I don't use that when I'm talking, because people say, oh, well, this is so soft around the edges. I remember there was a great athlete in Bosnia. I wrote a couple of books on Bosnia.
I have a few.
and she was like really rough and tough and, et cetera, et cetera. And women, as mothers, blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, Roddy, you're not a mother. And she said, oh, but I could be. So it's really interesting. There's that strong identity, the maternal identity. We never know if it's culture or to what extent it's physiological, but it doesn't matter. It just is.
Now, Ambassador Hunt, I know you've done work regarding issues relating to conflict. Can you give us an example from your work about how women can stop conflict and being a part of the process before war begins that could be helpful?
Sure, I'm happy to. First of all, let me say that the greatest predictor of a conflict is if the country has been in conflict, because you get a cycle. We work to get, they last on average about 5 years. So that's why your stats about what happens if you have women actively involved, where it's overwhelmingly more likely that it's going to last a long time. That's not just, good, so there'll be less guys that get shot. That's not what this is. This is about how do you stabilize? Because, after a war, it's not like, Susan and everyone in the audience, you all know, it's not like we had a war and the war is over and next month we had our trade and next month, the schools were open. That's not what it's like. And it's not what it's going to be like after COVID, by the way. There's going to be a huge amount of having to try to put the economy back together. And so if you can shorten that period of time, how do you do that? And what we know is that if women are at the table in a significant enough number, then they will, for example, they will bring issues into the conversation. This is so interesting. They'll bring issues into the conversation that otherwise aren't mentioned. And you say, well, what does that mean in terms of war and peace? Well, it means everything, because those treaties that I was talking about that fail in about 5 years, they fail in large part because they aren't accepted back in the village, right? They aren't widely, there's not a buy-in. So you get something like the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And there's this whole business about who's going to be at the table for the Good Friday talks. And it's all men. So these two women, one's Catholic worker, labor worker, May Blood. The other one's a professor, Monica McWilliams, and she's Protestant. And they say, hey, so George Mitchell, the great American, we should have women at this table. And he said, I know, but we wanted the heads of the parties. Now, please take note, please, that women tend to say, look, I'll work from the wings, or I'll be, I don't like to be like really out there, but I'll really support what you're doing, but from the background. Don't do that, okay?
It's time to be out there. Yes.
Yeah, and guys, you have a part in this. Really, you've got to tell the women, no, you need to head this up. Okay, so Monica and May say, okay, well, we want to be at the table. He said, well, you can't because you don't have a party. And they say, well, we'll have a party. And they say, well, you can't because it's 6 weeks and you have to get 15,000 signatures. They said, we'll get the signatures. And they can because they've been in the community for so long. Like they know everybody and everyone knows them. And so they do it. And Monica says, gee, we were the only neighborhood where our posters weren't torn down, because we were bringing people together from both sides, which is one of the things they do. But interesting to me, when you talk to Monica Williams, and by the way, after the Troubles ended, they had to have a new constitution. She was named the person who would write the Bill of Rights, right? So, but she said, we put all kinds of things into this agreement, and this gets to how it lasts. We put in about political prisoners, and as you know, it was a huge, huge problem about how many had been locked up. And she said, we said in the agreement, you let those boys out of prison, we will be responsible for them. We will personally be responsible so that they're not causing more trouble. They put in things like unified education. And you just think about this as a way a woman would think, but also what she can pull off. They said, we're not going to have any more in third grade. Some kids are learning about the terrible Catholics. The other are learning about the terrible Protestants. And then you just get this continuation of the anger. We're going to have one story, and all the kids are going to be learning the same story. And she talks about a dozen other things that were very, 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 very local. And you know what? These aren't professional war stoppers, right? These are
it's community members to really think about the needs of a society. And something you mentioned that really resonated with me is that when you have different people around the table, whether it's men and women, whether it's from different socioeconomic status, education level, shared experience, lived experience, what you create is this diversity of thought. And that's what we're really aiming to have. And I can see why that these solutions were so beneficial to the communities, because having that diversity of thought around the table is the secret sauce to creating better solutions for the world. And that's what it's about.
Yeah, and Susan, it's not, and that's not just about a peace agreement. I mean, we know the stats in terms of a board of directors of a company, in terms of which are the ones that tend to not get into trouble. It's because you get women mixed with men. And by the way, the women mixed with men is a stronger combination than just women or just men. Some really interesting research on that. So it is that mix, Susan. And one of the first things that women ask when they get around the table is, who's not here?
Mm-hmm.
Really interesting. It's really interesting. It's not like, hey, I'm here now. It's not this kind of me power thing. I made it. They say, who's not here? I wonder, Susan, if it's because they're so used to being excluded themselves, or I wonder if there's something where women, where they're thinking in terms of a whole, like a family. I don't know, but I do know that that's what they ask. Therefore, you get more stability. It happens all over the place. It happened in Colombia. They tried to have a peace agreement to stop the war with the FARC, and it was when women got involved and started bringing all these other issues in.
Well, I'm hearing some questions come in from our audience, and so I'd love to ask you something coming from Patrice. And she mentions that COVID and the huge childcare crisis that we're facing right now is really making a decline in women's participation, and especially in the workforce. And now, and I haven't checked the stats, so Patrice, I hope you're right. We're now back into levels experienced into 1988. So what does this mean for women having a seat at the table in the next 1, 5, 10 years? She's concerned about this major setback for women in leadership roles, whether it's in private or the public sector.
Yeah, I think there's every reason to be concerned about that. I was listening, as you were, Patrice, to the forecast, if you will, by people who really know this stuff. I was on CNN, and I was really surprised. I expected there to be a response from this policymaker. Women are so strong, they're just going to bounce back. And that's not clear at all. I don't know if you remember, Susan, or Patrice, the whole stats are on the mommy track. Remember about how when you have a kid and you get out of your career for just 2 years, whatever it is, you never, ever make it up. You didn't just miss those 2 years in terms of your career. You created an idea in people's minds that you aren't as committed, or you aren't we can't count on you because you didn't put your job first or whatever. And I think a lot of this is so unconscious in terms of the way that women get shafted. I don't think it's guys who are wanting to do women in. I really don't. May I play off of that, Susan, and tell a personal story that is my failure story? It's my worst story.
Please do. We love a good story.
Yeah. Well, I was, as you mentioned, hosting negotiations. And this was, everyone knows about the Dayton agreements to stop the war in Bosnia. And before that, we had a 3-way war. And so we needed to make it a 2-way war. I know it sounds odd to say it like that, but it's very hard to stop a 3-way war. So there were 2 parts that we wanted to get together, and they were the Croats, who are Roman Catholic, and then the Muslims. So those are the negotiations I hosted. It was about 14 days of negotiations. It was in 2 sets, all right? It was people who were really, really, really memorable. Some of them hadn't had meat to eat in 3.5 years.
Wow.
While the city was under siege. I mean, this was one of those things where you know who's in the room, right?
Right.
And so I was going back and forth. I was the host, brought him over to my house when things got stuck. And, I did all kinds of things that just to concentrate on bringing these people together. So it works. And so then we have the agreement's going to be signed at the White House. Okay. So in walk, but before the signatories walked in, which was the president of Croatia and of the Muslim group, and President Clinton. Before they walked in, I stood up. It was in one of those little theater rooms. In other words, the seats are kind of elevated.
Mm-hmm.
And so I stood up. I was on the front. And I looked back. Susan, I couldn't believe it was a sea of gray suits. And I thought, hell's bells. Actually, I thought something that isn't suitable for the camera.
Won't say that on the webinar.
Right. I thought, how did this happen? I've been a feminist all my life. I've been organizing organizations. I always look in the room and see how many women are there, blah, 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 blah. I look in first class when I walk into an airport and airplane. By the way, do that. It's all men. So anyway, so I'm thinking, how did I not notice in 14 days that it was all men? And then I realized I didn't notice because I was looking through a certain lens. I was looking through the security lens. And this was long before I started this work, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, a few years. And so when I looked through the security lens, I was looking at the stereotypic idea. If I had said, through looking at a different lens, gender lens, there are some people missing here. And where are they? And how do we find them? How do we get them in here? We would have had a different agreement. The agreement in Bosnia was not successful. For all that people talk about at the end of the war was going to end anyway soon. And we ended up, I won't go into the reasons it wasn't successful, but it wasn't. And
well, as you mentioned that, though, Ambassador Hunt, there is a comment here from Jennifer Brush, who said she worked for you in Vienna. And she mentioned that it was, of course, these accords were hammered together by a group of men in an airplane hangar in Ohio. And some were even indicted for war crimes. And while the Dayton Accords were meant to stop the war, and it's been embraced by Serbia and Russia, however, this was really deteriorated in the meantime. And so do you have any recommendations for reversing the wrongs of these accords? Because it seems that it's created these ethnic enclaves.
The country ended up much, much, much more divided after the peace agreement than it was before. And so, Jennifer, first of all, it's great to hear your name and to think of our work together long ago. In terms of what we would do now, obviously part of it is to break the myth that it was so successful. And then you just have to get women's voices there. And after they put together the parliament, there was one woman in the new parliament, one woman, Medea Filipovic. And so there was so much wrong about that in terms of there was no quota for women, et cetera. When that happened in Rwanda, which was at the same time, I'm avoiding your question, Susan, about what to do about it. I'm thinking of an answer over here, but I'm talking meanwhile, because this is important too. In Rwanda, so you have a 3-month horror, right? 10% of the population is slaughtered with machetes. And so that would be the equivalent of 35 million Americans in a summer, just so that we're, that 10%. Let's just get it in our heads, right? Women have never at that point been outside the home to speak of. If a man is visiting, they can't speak. So this is not Sweden. And women, once they got to be, and they did it in a way of pushing themselves up through village councils, they came to be first election, 40%.
Wow.
And then they went up into the 60s. When I was writing my book, Wandering Women Rising, they were at 64%. They were able to reverse any kind of discrimination against women. They did a land reform so women could own property. And we're talking about really basic in terms of what was needed. They all kinds of reforms and longevity, life longevity is not the right word. It just skyrocketed, et cetera, et cetera. Why didn't that happen in Bosnia? it's interesting that it could happen when you have that much chaos. That's part of what happens. When you have chaos, like you had in Rwanda, everything's up for grabs. And you walk into a Capitol, there isn't a piece of paper. There are corpses piled up everywhere, everywhere. There's not a shovel even to bury the corpses. And in that chaos, women stepped forward. It's what you were saying. They leaned forward into it and they said, this is destroying our families. This is completely intolerable. Who is going to put this back together? And the men, y'all, I'm sorry to say it, but men tend to deal with defeat very differently from how women do. They become very depressed. That's where you see the alcoholism often, when the economy implodes, et cetera, in let's say the Soviet Union, but that's typical. They sort of retreat to the corner and they're paralyzed. Women get really, really energized in those settings.
Well, I know your work in Bosnia was so important, and it's really in the book you wrote quite groundbreaking. And you have a friend here, Lana from Bosnia, and she wants to know, how do you persist when you work on these tough conflicts, these tough issues, and heart-wrenching situations? How do you persist in your work?
Oh, Lana, thank you for asking that question. Thank you, because I teach also, right? I mean, I've had like 800 students at Harvard. I ask them that at the very beginning. I say, where do you draw your strength? Where does it come from? I have my answer, but my answer isn't your answer, right? Mine is my very strong religious teachings and poetry, and also getting outside.
Yes.
Other people will say it's their children. I mean, my kids know, they're just no, but I love my children, but that's not what gives me my strength, right? And it took me a long time to find my voice, Lana, a long time. I was raised in Dallas, a very, very conservative setting. We weren't allowed to speak at the table. It's kind of like Rwanda. And so I felt like I didn't find my voice until I was in my mid-30s. And
why is that? Why mid-30s? Was there a special time that made that unique?
I think I'm a late bloomer. Actually, I helped put together a women's foundation, which was, and those are all over the world now. It's where you get women with means, like I have, and this is a model. They put their money together, they invest it in the market, and then they take the yield, and they then use it for scholarships for women to get PhDs or to get into college. They use it to stop domestic violence, blah, 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 blah. Okay. And when I helped put that together, and I was a key person, I was asked to be the president. I said, no, I don't do the president thing. And they said, well, we really think it's important. I was the third president because I didn't do the president thing. The night before, Susan, I've never told you this, the night before I was going to be, whatever you are, inaugurated as president, I had a dream. I had a dream, and I was in my basement, and the basement was filled with mud. It wasn't actually mud, but I won't go into that.
Keep it at the mud, yes.
Yeah, we'll keep it at mud. And I was down there, and I was just shoveling and shoveling and shoveling. Now, any psychiatrist will tell you that is about just this kind of fear and anxiety and like, I don't know if I can do this, etc. That's who I was. And I was, another way, Lana, and what I would say to the women here, choose very carefully who your partner is going to be. Really, really, really carefully. My first husband, bells and whistles, madly in love, lasted 15 years. But as I found my voice, he withdrew because he said, you don't need me anymore. And I said, yeah, but I choose you. Isn't that better? And so then I married this other guy, symphony conductor, and he was all excited that, he wanted to plan my whole career. So I said, okay, plan my career. And he was like, when he was dying, which was 10 years ago, he was 66. He had the same tumor as Ted Kennedy and John McCain. Okay. So I said to him, CA, Charles Ansbacher, CA, what do you feel best about in your life? Just like this. He said, your work. Holy cow. What he felt best about in his life, he was very, very successful. He conducted 30 orchestras. What he felt best about was my work. Yeah.
Supportive partner. And, it's fascinating you mentioned that. When I was interviewing leaders for my book that I wrote, and this because you have a quote on the back of the book, and you happily helped me recommend the book to so many others. But I found, though, that many ambassadors and foreign ministers say who you partner with is very important. Now, that doesn't matter who you partner with or how you see yourself and intersectionality of self, but your partner in life, do they support you? Do they raise you up? Do they want to see you succeed?
Yeah,
and do you want them to succeed? And that's very important in how they speak to you, how you speak to them. But will they be flexible with your career? And however you identify, you want to know that your partner will have that flexibility, because that's what people need to really rise in their career.
I'm real interested in what you're saying. When I went to Vienna, Jennifer will tell you this, Jennifer Brush. So one of the things that happens is that the American ambassador is like queen of the world. And I mean, seriously, there's the president, there's the prime minister, and the American ambassador. I think it's probably all over the world because we were the lone superpower. So everybody who's coming in as a new ambassador has to come and pay homage, and, say, I don't know, please like me, or whatever. And so I hated those calls, just hated them. But I did pay attention to, they're called courtesy calls, and I've never been into courtesy, as you can tell. I keep interrupting you. So anyway.
So they name a conversation, Ambassador Hunt. We're good.
Thank you. So there were 12 women, 12 other women, 12 other women ambassadors. Of those 12, there was one that was married. It's exactly to your point. Either they were divorced, but more often they had never married.
Wow.
And it's exactly to your point, because it's so hard to find a supportive partner. In this case, female, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it would be different if it was two women, right? But that there are so many things we could talk about, the whole sociological, why is it that you need a certain, make the difference instead of just one, and how do women, how do women bridge divides, all of those lessons, we talk about them in terms of war, but so basic. It's really true across life, regardless of what your profession is, your sphere.
Yes, completely. And we have another question I want to ask you from the audience. This is from Nakhla. She's a professor from Michigan and works at American University in Dubai. And she said that she met you in person at your house in Boston after you invited her to the Women Waging Peace Symposium. She mentions that you are her role model and you impacted her interest in gender issues. So Nakhla, we're pleased to have you today. And she wants to know, Ambassador Hunt, do you think women's empowerment also needs a paradigm shift in the mindset of society, rather than having more women in parliament or in Congress or a seat at the table, more of a paradigm shift in thinking?
Don't you hate it when people say both? So I won't say that, but it's both. But let me tell you a story that gets exactly to what you're talking about. First of all, the numbers do matter. They matter hugely, but it is this paradigm shift. When we were Secretary of State on a statement about why you have to have women fully involved in the war and peace decisions. And it was for the G7. And it was going to be a paper that they were going to then accept or not. And so secretary says to me, this is so-and-so, and he will work with you on this. Now, so-and-so turned out to be ambassador multiple times, et cetera. And so I said, that sounds great, and I'll do the first draft and blah, blah. And he said, no, let Bill do the first draft. I said, no, that's okay. I'll do the first draft. No, I think that Bill should do the first draft. Well, I mean, pick your battles. Bill comes in with a draft, and the first paragraph is, oh, those poor women, because they're getting creamed in these wars. Rape is no longer a spoil of war; it's a tool of war. They're losing everything, their kids, or blah 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 blah. Poor women, and then you get to, and they should have these seats at the table. And I thought, no, I don't think you can do it that way. Once you start with, oh, those poor victims, it's very, very hard to get to, and they are leaders and blah, blah, blah. And because I think that we respond as human beings in different parts of our makeup, right? If you tell me about victims, it pulls my heart. Absolutely. If you tell me women should be at the table, because you're going to end up with a peace agreement that lasts, that's in my head, okay? I can't get out of my heart to get to my head. If you start with pulling my sympathy, that's the shift. People don't even think about that. They think, oh, well, the shift is, let's see, that women have to be appreciated. Well, sure they do, but the appreciation can come from the fabulous job they do at the table. So we have to really, really take seriously our respect for women. And by the way, our respect for ourselves, like what I was telling you, mid-30s, finding my voice. So I think you have to start with that sense of agency, and that these women have an expertise, like you were saying, Susan, they have an expertise that is very, very hard to come by otherwise. And we need them. We need them if we're going to have this agreement.
100%. And Ambassador Hunt, I know that of the many things you're known for, one of them is creating the Harvard Women Public and Policy Program. And I want to know personally, share with us behind the scenes how this program got started, some of its successes, and where it is today. I know it's been a huge part of what you've done for students to really train them on not only public policy, but soft power, diplomacy. So tell us more about the beginning of that program.
Yeah, sure. And when we talk about students, they average about 30 years old because it's a graduate school only. And also you can't go to the Kennedy School unless you've had usually 4 to 6 years in the field. So it's not your regular college student. I was asked to come by Joe Nye. Joe had been Assistant Secretary of Defense, I should say Dean Nye, because at that point he was. When you look at the history of people in international affairs and who the leading voices are, Joe Nye's name appears probably more commonly in the top 4 than any other person.
Wow.
One of the things that he did, what'd you say?
I said, wow.
Yeah. And one of the things, and this will show you why, one of the things he came up with was the notion of soft power.
Right.
Now, soft power doesn't mean soft around the edges. Joe had seen the effect of bombs and bullets. And we know why George Marshall was able to stop war after World War II, because he watched what happened in World War I when we went in and trampled, the vanquished, and we ended up with Hitler. So in the same way that General Marshall, instead of going in with bombs and bullets, and he said, let's put together a steel company, and we'll get the French and the Germans to work on the steel company. together, and you talk about an idea just out of the blue, and of course it led to the European Union eventually, and no more wars. All right. So Joe was very much into this idea of soft power, and he said that we can't. Well, he said the best example of soft power is how women operate, because soft power is about influence. Soft power is about being a model that other people want to replicate. It's about diplomacy. I was really taken. I'm sure you noticed, Susan, when Joe Biden made his first visit in foreign policy to the State Department and said, "This is the key. You all are the key." And when Hillary was Secretary of State, it was Bill Gates at Defense who actually funded a lot of her work. No one knows that because he had the money at Defense, and the State Department is the poor stepsister. So there are people, and in those examples, it's men who say, "Wait a minute, what we're trying isn't working. Let's see what the women can do." So we put together the Women in Public Policy program. And it's interesting to me that you said made such a difference with the students. And it is true that it's called the acceptance rates. It's not how many women apply, because in the past, women applied at the same rate as men, but then they would choose another place that they had also gotten into. The head of admissions said, after we had the Women in Public Policy program, the numbers of women just zoomed.
Wow.
But it's the faculty also who are affected. And I was on a panel right after, soon after, maybe 2 years after we started it. I directed it for 10 years. And it was a panel, it was a Harvard-wide deal. And someone, I think it was Lonnie Guinier from the law school, made a comment that the Women in Public Policy program is the biggest thing that Harvard has for women. I thought, holy Toledo. I'm cleaning up my language so much for you, Susan.
Holy cow.
Holy cow. Holy cow. We're nothing. I mean, we're this big. You're telling me this is the most important thing for women? But actually, Harvard is light years behind the rest of the world in terms of women. So we started doing very groundbreaking work, like bringing 110 women from 10 conflict areas. This is what she was talking about. And we brought delegations of women who were on different sides of the conflict. I thought that what was going to happen was that I wanted to prove that this isn't just all about those great Africans. We're going to go all over the world and bring them together. And I thought, well, this is super because they will exchange their ideas with each other and their experience about what they did to stop war or prevent it. Well, it turns out that what was the most meaningful to them was the sense that they weren't alone.
Right.
Because women in particular work better in groups, right? And as I said earlier, these aren't professional war stoppers. It's like the principal of the school. It's like the cardiologist who's the head of the hospital. And then suddenly there's all this chaos. And I think, Susan, that there is leadership, right? That some of us are, if you will, I don't want to say born leaders, that's trite, but we have this leadership capacity. It's going to show up someplace.
It sounds like, Ambassador Hunt, you created the table, essentially, at Harvard in order to have chairs and have seats. So really creating that table for inclusion and to bring these voices. And one person that you impacted, I see a note here from Brigadier General Sean Campbell, who says, "You know you won me over at Harvard." And he wants to know, Ambassador Hunt, have you been able to adjust the mindsets of men who have been hesitant or obstructive in ensuring that more women have a seat at the table?
Oh, look, and these guys, there are some real creeps, but for the most part, they're not. They're like, they're like me in Vienna, not seeing what the issue is. So after shock and awe, hi, Sean, first of all. Sean was my student, and I just went to his promotion ceremony. It was very, very exciting. So there's shock and awe, right? We go in, bomb the hell out of Baghdad, et cetera. And so I go to the Pentagon and I meet with the general who's running it from the Pentagon. Now, one of the mistakes we often make is we run the big conflicts from Washington. So you don't have that sense of what's happening. You don't have your fingers on the pulse that women tend to have. So I say, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. And he says, oh, yes. I'm so glad you came over. And he gives me coffee. I'm sipping my coffee. And I say, look, time is precious. Let me say it. This is the moment. This is the moment right now. Don't wait. Right now, you've got to bring the women in because they know where the weapons are. They know which disaffected boys have weapons under their mattresses. They know who your natural allies are. They know where the enemies are in the community. They bridge the divides. They can go places where men can't go because they're less threatening. And I gave him like all of these reasons. You got to get them now. Get them right now in because this is when it's being the whole the norm is being set, but also the trajectory. Lovely man. Couldn't have been nice. Said, thank you so much for coming. And Madam Ambassador, I want to assure you that when we get the place secure, we are going to be able to turn to women's issues. And I thought, you couldn't have had a nicer guy, right? But I was not
at the same time.
I wasn't talking about cervical cancer.
Right.
Right? I mean, that is a women's issue. Cervical cancer, right? There are very, very, very few women's issues. And so I thought, how could he not in a whole hour hear what I was saying? Especially when I said, this isn't about women's issues, basically. This is about security.
Right.
And so it's hard. And we're back to that question that was at the very beginning about the mindset and, do we need to change the mindset or is it change, or do we need to get women around the table? One of the ways you change the mindset is when men get used to seeing women around the table. So that's why I said it's both. It's interactive, it's iterative.
And echoing them too. I know some of our audiences ask what can we actually do? And so if you are on this webinar right now and you have a seat at the table, bring more people who are diverse in mindset, whether they're women or whether they identify as however they identify, different socioeconomic status, race, religion, culture, upbringing, all of that. And then when they're at the table, elevate their voice. So if they give an idea, don't just brush over it. Say, great idea, so-and-so. Let's hear more of that. Say it again. So there are different ways that we can actually incorporate what to do. And throughout this series, we're going to be sharing skills and what you can do, the audience, to bring more seats to the table. And Ambassador Hunt, we are almost at our time. So if you have one final word before we go into closing remarks, we'd love to hear from you.
Sure. This is not about simply what women can do. And it's also, sorry, but it's not about women's empowerment. I just can't go, these women are powerful. We are powerful, right?
We're here. We're powerful.
But
yes.
I don't want to underestimate the effect of Sean or other men to say, boy, that was interesting, Ambassador, what you just said 5 minutes ago that everyone else brushed over. He doesn't have to say that, right? But boy, that was interesting. He doesn't even have to say, I agree with you. He doesn't even have to repeat what I said. Just say my name. Just acknowledge that I exist and do it twice. Have 3 people acknowledge that I spoke, and my status every time goes up. And anyone can do that in any sphere. But you have to think about it before the meeting, right? And until it becomes a way of life, or a way of your thinking. But that is across the board.
It is, and you're so right. It looks like we are at time, so I'm going to thank you, Ambassador Hunt, for being with us today. Of course, we wish we had more time to be with you, and there are so many more questions. And friends, join us online for more of this conversation, and you can get in touch with Ambassador Hunt online. Look up Swanee Hunt, Google it, and you will find her website. It's amazing. I looked all through it. And you can connect with her and get on her listserv. A special thank you to the World Trade Center of Washington, D.C. and Dublin and Webport Global, and a special thank you to the entire audience. Of course, if you're going to join us online for this conversation, use the hashtags Diplomacy Table and Where Leaders Lead. And remember, if you miss part of this program, you're in luck, because this webinar and the whole series is recorded, and it's going to be available on the YouTube channel of the Ronald Reagan Building and the International Trade Center within a week.
Susan, Christmas is coming. Christmas is coming eventually. And people need to get your book now.
Thank you.
Multiple copies. Multiple copies.
Yes, and it's out in audiobook too. So you can hear these stories of these leaders and research and how to get more seats at the table. And we'll hope you join us for the rest of this series, Seat at the Table, Women in Global Leadership. I'll be in conversation with Ambassador Capricia Marshall on April 27th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And on May 25th, we'll be back at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. You won't want to miss it, with Her Royal Highness Ambassador Rima from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Ambassador Hunt. I'm Susan Sloan, and you have a seat at the table.
Great.